Everybody to the Punch Bowl. I think we've got some new faces in here. Looking down the guest list, so it's good to see everybody. I think this is the sixth installment. We're back after a little break, so it's good to see everybody again. We're going back to basics this time, and so I want to introduce our panelists who we've got with us. We've got Steve Bayshore, the director of historic trades at Mount Vernon. He is a master miller and a master distiller. We got Alan Bishop with us, master distiller from Spirits of French Lick and all-around spirits historian. If you come to a lot of our distillery events at Locust Grove, you'll see Alan there with us, helping us out.
Been called worse, so thank you.
What's that?
I said I've been called worse, so thank you.
We've got Alicia Monroe, and it is Monroe is the current name, yes?
It is.
Okay, I was trying to remember which was the maiden name and which was the married name. But Alicia is the distiller at West Overton in Pennsylvania. And so this whole idea started as a broader initiative. We were calling the Odyssey Project to kind of track the progression of things from east to west in the time of COVID while we're starting to develop all these virtual programs and everything. And so the Odyssey Project, unfortunately, we haven't got to work a whole lot with that, but this group has gotten to stick together. And so that's why you see these different regions represented. And why we got this specific group together was so that you would see different regions and then how they translated as they moved west. So that's kind of where we are. Just a reminder to keep your microphones muted, ask questions in the chat. Hannah will be helping me see which ones we need to answer, and I'll get those in as we can. We have a new guest Toastmaster with us this evening. We have Aiden Pemberton, who is the best cider maker I know, even though he's not doing it commercially yet. I hope to change that one day. So he's viewed the show before. You'll also see him a lot of times down at the distillery with us at Locust Grove. But he's going to lead us in our toast tonight. And so since we're about to toast, I want to ask everybody on our panel, what are we drinking?
Well, I'm drinking a little Weller Antique.
Oh, excellent.
So I'm going with our brand new, I don't know if you can even see it because my stupid background. Oh, I'll get it in a minute. Anyways, brand new Lee W. Sinclair, Spirits of French Lick. This is the Iconoclast, so small batch, 107.9 proof, just came out today.
Excellent. Alicia, what you got?
I have, this is a limited release in Pennsylvania and Ohio. It's an 11-year-old Old Overholt that they just released this year.
Nice.
Very nice. I try to keep it thematic. I'm really more in a beer mood tonight, but I poured just a little bit. Since we're taking it back to basics, we're having some Heaven Hills mellow corn in a plastic jug. Okay, so this is just plain old corn whiskey, and there's some very trendy bartenders out there trying to do some very trendy things in it, but it's okay that it's what it is. It is plain corn whiskey. It's back to basics, and so that's what we're doing tonight. So, Aiden, what you drinking, and lead us off?
Well, just to get started, I'm drinking the 14-year-old Glenmorangie Quinta Ruben edition. It has a lovely rose gold color, and I thought it would be appropriate to have tonight because, as many of you probably know, this past Monday was Robert Burns' birthday and Burns Night in Scotland. And I thought that the most appropriate thing to lead us off tonight is something from Burns Night, and it's the Selkirk Grace. It's what's said at the beginning of every Burns Night supper, according to tradition at least. And this is attributed to Robert Burns himself. So without further ado, raise your glasses. Some hae meat and cannot eat, and some would eat that want it, but we hae meat and we can eat, and say the Lord be thanked. Cheers.
Cheers.
And this is just to remind us all to be grateful for the things that we have. And I think that's very important now in the midst of our pandemic. So with that, take us off, Brian.
Thank you so much, Aiden. It's good to see you here with us. I'm looking at the timeline. I was supposed to introduce everybody now, but we've already got everybody introduced. So just a reminder, please keep your mics muted. We do welcome your questions. And so please ask those in the chat. Credit for the idea for this program goes to Caitlin Tisdale, Locust Grove Director of Education. She was telling me, she's like, I love the shows. It's very impressive. You all know a ton, but can we take it back to the basics? Can we get back down to the basics of distilling? Get us to where we can understand better what you're talking about. So that's that's where we are now. And I think we want to start tonight with what the root of distillation really is. We always think of it as it's a luxury, it's a tourist attraction, and this and that. There would be no distillation if there wasn't agriculture. So let's start off with talking about about the agriculture. What is it about it that led to distillation, and what is it that fed it through history and feeds it today?
Yeah, it's just it's another piece of agricultural work, like you just said. I mean, everything in society stems from agriculture. Society itself stems from agriculture. So, the other part of that is that inebriants tend to be keys in societies, and societies are always looking for new inebriants that, usually start off as medicines. Plant medicine, obviously, goes right alongside alcohol. So, you go back as far as you want, you're going to have mead, you're going to have beer, you're going to have cider, wine. And then eventually somebody's going to figure out that, if you can evaporate the alcohol off of the rest of that useless stuff that's in there, you can have a better inebriant, better living through science. So it's a pretty linear thing, but it's just a way. Distilling has always been a way of creating medicine, as well as a tool to reach some altered state of consciousness, as well as a way to preserve your crops, preserve not only your crops, but also, almost on a spiritual level, preserve those essences, those characters that made those crops what they were when they were ripe in the field. So that if you know what an apple tree smells like in late summer, and you're setting in January in southern Indiana and there's 4 inches of snow on the ground, you can still access that as a almost living entity in front of you. It has the aroma, it has some of that taste. It reminds you maybe of better times where there's more sunlight and there's birds, and life is maybe a little easier in the summertime. So I think all of those things are directly interwoven into the culture of distillation history.
Yeah, I would say that was the whole reason we started the program at Locust Grove, which kind of got us here, was trying to hook people into the story of the agriculture. There's plenty of distilleries in Kentucky. It wasn't just a fun idea to do a distillery, but it was an enticing thing that really reminded people that all of these parts of the farm work together. And also that people weren't just suffering waiting for refrigeration to come along. This was all part of how you preserve your crops. It's how you relate it to the food.
It is very much so. And very much, again, a way of just preserving those things and becoming part of a local food shed overall. Right. And I think even on a commercial level, and I think Steve can speak to this too, once distillation finally gets to that point, and I think we'll get through all this as we go, once it finally gets to a point where it can be commercialized to some extent, it's still about that local food shed. It's still about the local agriculture. It's still about what raw materials are available to you. And it's a pretty good leap if you think about it. If you go through the true history of distillation, you follow it throughout the decades and the centuries. It's amazing it took as long as it did to get to where it was going in some ways.
And I think that ties to the development of cultures over time. Because if you go back thousands of years, you can see the hieroglyphics in Egypt of people making grain-based alcohol. And so it starts local, it remains local for so long, but trade routes also influence so much in economies, and alcohol also becomes a commodity for trade for other goods. So I think it's interesting to look at each culture's development of whatever spirits became known in that region. And you can go way back, but you think of, cognac and cognac, champagne and champagne, rye whiskey in early America, or other parts of Europe and the various wines that developed. It all comes from those local farms and develops through the cultural milieu till economies grow or nation states grow, and then things become a broader market. So, you can look at it in the micro, and then you can apply it to the development of what we look at as the modern world and what's on the scene today. But I think it's fun to go back to the antecedents, the early development, and trace a little of that, because in those cultural differences come flavors people like in certain regions. You've talked in a few punch bowls about Southern Indiana and the apple brandy development. And so that's another way to kind of look at spirits, because, it's kind of like grist mills for me. It's like you go to another country, you see similarities, but the mill's different. It does the same kind of thing, but look how they built that. Look how they created that. So I think you can't avoid the cultural influence on spirits, because that's why we have all these various things to consume today.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think too that like even now that history is still informing most modern distillers, especially younger craft distillers, right? So you talk about that cultural relativism, you know, with agriculture and the development of distillation, and you can kind of divide the world in half, right? So you've got, you know, sort of the Chinese influence on one side of the wall, and then you've got the European influence on the other. And it always amazes me looking back into history with the development of distillation. You know, you can trace China distilling back to about 800 BC.
Really?
Which
I did
is
not know
super impressive.
Wow.
You get into the Western world and you don't really see even just very primitive distillation until you get into the Greeks and then some of the Arabian cultures. There's several hundred years in between. And what's odd still even to this day, things that people can still learn, things that distillers can still learn, is how little of the methodology in Asia has changed from 800 BC to now, and how little of that has ever been applied to Western distillation. So there's still even in the Western society, amongst different, you know, spirits and spirits cultures, there's still a ton for new distillers or old distillers to learn and apply based on agriculture. I mean, Brian and I learned this past year. We were playing around with an absinthe project, and we have no idea what wormwood from Indiana is going to taste like in an absinthe, but we have to. You know, It's agricultural. The land is going to influence the way that tastes. So
I think that's the neat thing about what we're looking at in America, you know, is that we're taking those influences of all these different parts of Europe and then infusing them into the American scene. You know, and so it's like that, and that created its own unique thing. What Alan's talking about, we're recreating and Alan found this research. We're currently recreating an absinthe as it was done in Switzerland County, Indiana, in the 1830s. It's a big partnership between Spirits of French Lick and Locust Grove and Kentucky Artisan Distillery and Musée des Vinoges. And so we're actually, these people from Switzerland in Europe brought this knowledge with them to Switzerland County, and then that became part of their agricultural cycle as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on an agricultural level too, a little more on that. You know, those people who are from Switzerland were originally from France, so they had a viticultural background, which they couldn't really practice when they were in Switzerland. But once they got back to over here to the Midwest and landed in Kentucky, and then eventually in Switzerland County, Indiana, they went right back to wine production. So because grapes would grow very well in the Ohio Valley if you chose the right ones. But so much of distillation is based around what is available to you, what can you use, and people think that things are fixed in history, especially, you know, from my experience with distillation, my background, my history. You know, everybody thinks that bourbon has always been a thing ever since, you know, America was founded, the United States was founded, ever since Kentucky really got up and going. But bourbon doesn't really become a thing until about 1821 or so. And prior to that, it's really based more on what do you have, what's available to you, what can you use to make alcohol out of, and nothing is fixed. You might even be, you know, you may be an Irish farm distiller, or, you know, moonshiner as it were at the time, and you would think that obviously barley and malted barley would be common, and they were, but wheat and oats were just as common. And you know what, if you don't got any wheat or oats, if you can grow some squash or some pumpkins, hey, let's throw those in the still. Anything you can ferment, and anything that's going to be extra, anything that's going to go bad otherwise in storage, that you're not going to be able to make use of, you can distill it into alcohol. So you're making use of everything that you possibly can. The same thing with those medicinal elements we talked about that are also agricultural, or even you know, going back even further, those are still kind of hunter-gatherer things, right? So if you take some of the different botanical spirits, you know, that's really people trying to preserve medicine out of season in a way that makes sense. So really distillation, even though it doesn't span the entire, you know, history of human civilization, it tells a microcosm of human civilization, what the real struggle of human civilization is as far as agricultural production, and what's sustainable and what works and what doesn't, and how do you learn those things. So,
well, in the history of spirits being medicinal, that's an interesting angle, you know, because we laugh a little about it today, but it's so very true over the centuries. And in the 18th and 19th century, that remains very strong. And You know, I know in Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, you know, you can read the accounts of that thinking is very strong. Even tobacco was thought to be medicinal. We, you know, again, we know a lot more about medicine now, but thinking about living in Virginia or Pennsylvania on the frontier, that, you know, that very well was a medicine, you know, and very important. But let's maybe shift a little bit and talk about the basics. So that's kind of an overview in a way, but
that's the why. Now we'll go to the how.
Yeah, the fermentation, you know, the ingredients, and what is fermentation all about? Maybe that's where we should kind of talk a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I agree, because I'm sure there are a number of people who are, you know, they're familiar with beer, they're familiar with wine, but they may not be as familiar with spirits and how similar those processes really are. So, of course, in nature, going again, kind of back to agriculture, you know, when something begins to rot, as we call it, you know, it's usually the result of fungus and single-celled organisms, bacteria, etc. But some of those particular fungus species and some of the bacteria also have the ability to transfer sugar into CO2 and ethanol. You know, and a lot of times in plants, and this is kind of an interesting scientific thing, some of the seeds that you have in some of the plants out there, some of the agrarian plants, they actually have a germination inhibitor, and fermentation is necessary for those plants to actually be able to grow, to be able to germinate. So, you know, I don't know what I don't know that anyone will ever know the history of fermentation as far as who was the first to observe this. And
I want to know who was the first one who walked out and said, you know, I'm going to drink that.
Right. Yeah.
Sitting in that barrel for about 92 days, but I'm going to go ahead and see what happens.
I always figured there was some you know, hedge witch, right? But not really hedge witch, much older tradition. But I always figured that somewhere back around 12,000 years ago, somebody was on the outskirts of town and tripped over a honey tree that got knocked over in a storm. You know, they're like, oh, there's some honey, and then, well, this tastes odd, but it also, you know, it's kind of opening some doors here. So
yeah, and they made it to town 7 weeks later. Fine, yeah.
Yeah, I lived through it. I'm good.
Yeah,
I'm good. Now we got to figure out what plants we can put in it.
Yeah. So let's we got a question today for the panelists over email, and sadly, this fellow said that this was not covered on distillery tours, and the direct question was, is fermentation a chemical process of sugar being converted into alcohol?
Yes.
Yes. Right.
Yes.
If he's on here right now, I knew it was a biological process. I mean, I didn't get high enough marks in chemistry to know if that transferred to chemical process or not.
Right. Well, you're basically changing out one molecule for another through an organism, sometimes multiple organisms. But yeah, the basic premise is that yeast has the ability to break down short chain sugars into CO2 and ethanol, and they're basically eating themselves out of existence, is what they're doing. So they're taking those sugars and breaking them down further and further and further until you've actually changed the chemical composition of the base, and presented it as something entirely different, which is really what alchemy is in itself. You know, it's just a metaphor for what the yeast is doing. So the basic premise is with any distillation that you're trying to find the best way to access those fermentable sugars, those sugars that the yeast can actually metabolize and make into something. And that varies very much based on what that base alcohol or that base product is, not base alcohol, that base product is. So, you know, it's going to vary between fruit, which is a little more readily accessible to yeast, honey, which can be, you know, if you add a little water to it and destabilize it some, or starch from grains. So it always amazes me. We're so far removed from agriculture, and this is another callback, how few people, and this is something I think we should spend some time on, because people can understand in a very basic way how an apple ferments, right? It makes sense, it's logical. But people aren't necessarily aware of where does the sugar and whiskey in the beer come from, right? You know, you watch all these shows and on TV, moonshiners, for example, and guys are throwing bags of sugar into a barrel, right? And that's how some of these people think that alcohol is made. But there was no Costco in, you know, 1770. There was no Walmart to go to and buy bags of sugar. But the basic process is you're reversing nature. So, you know, if you're talking about a grain, for example, you're trying to take those long chain stored carbohydrates, which are really sugar, and break them back down into sugar. So everything that happened in the growing season, where the plant is trying to create seeds and store enough energy to grow again the next year, as a brewer or as a distiller, potentially, you're trying to reverse that process. You're going to break down those long chain starches into short chain sugars. So you're basically creating your own sugar. There's no Walmart, there's no Costco. You're not going and buying the sugar and adding it to the corn. The sugar's already there. You just have to be able to get to it.
Alicia, you kind of think I have one of the most challenging versions of that with rye.
Yeah, so rye is sticky and viscous, and it hates you. And it is just the messiest thing. And then add to that our setup, we tried to be cognizant of what the Overholts would do and have without completely going like a Steve Bayshore route with period replicas. So we're somewhere between that and a modern distillery. So there's a lot of paddling, there's a lot of precise heat and holding temperatures to try to break all those long chains down into those short chain digestible sugars. And with us, we're really trying to stick to that 80-20 mash bill. So 80% rye, 20% malted barley, as best we can figure. We're as close as we can get. Now, we would love to get to a place where we're not adding any enzymes, but with our process right now, we're definitely adding lab-produced enzymes. So, we kind of take it from an approach of the best we can do right now, especially learning on the fly through the grace of all of these other distillers in our local network that'll say like, hey, you're doing that wrong. And then we calibrate and adjust, and I say, it smells real bad today. I don't know what happened. And we walk through it. But we try to take it from as agricultural a place and as a low intervention place as possible. But when we're working with the rye, it's just necessary to cheat a little bit right now.
Now you brought up a word there that I think we really need to really break down and provide a direct definition for in this program, which is malt. I think a lot of people hear malt and they don't know exactly what that means. And so, and all these grains can be malted: barley, rye, corn, wheat, and all that. So let's, and this goes directly to the point about what it is with the grain that the yeast actually eats to produce the alcohol. So let's break down really directly what malt is.
So Brian, let's expand that just a little bit if it's okay with you guys, because I think it would be good for everybody to do this. So we can talk about malt and we can talk about grain and that process that we just touched on. And then let's touch on fruit too. And I think Aiden would be a good one to go to on the fruit and what happens with fermentation with fruit. So as Alicia just mentioned and Brian just mentioned, malt is an integral part of creating a beer. So whiskey, for those who don't know, is essentially a distilled beer. Brandy, on the other hand, is essentially a distilled wine. Those are really the base definitions that everyone who's interested in distilling should be very familiar with. So the big thing is that with grain, again, you have to break down those starches into shorter chain sugars, and then you have to break them down yet again into even shorter chain sugars so the yeast can metabolize them. Back in the antiquity of distillation, there were no cheats, there were no shortcuts. In modern times, there exist what are called artificial exogenous enzymes. Those enzymes basically are breaking down those long chain starches. What was used way back when is malt, as Brian said, and what malt essentially is grain that has been germinated. And when that grain germinates, it does two things. So it creates its own enzymes, alpha amylase and beta amylase, some of which you have available to you when you eat something starchy. It turns sweet in your mouth. It's because of one of the enzymes in your saliva. The other is actually available via animals, fungus, etc. But when that grain germinates, it's basically converting part of its own starch into sugar to feed the growing plants, and it's also creating an extra amount of enzyme, which can be used to further break down starch into sugar to feed the young plants. But if you have the right types of grain, they have a very high diastatic power. And that diastatic power basically means that they're packed with so much of those enzymes that they can convert more than just their own starch into sugar. So if you're going to make a mash bill, as an example, you're going to be looking at like 12% malt roughly compared to the rest of your unmalted grains. And that 12% malt, if the mash bill works correctly, allows you to convert all of the corn in that recipe, or all the wheat in that recipe, or all the rye in that recipe into sugar as well, despite the fact that it is unmalted. I hope I did a halfway decent job of getting through that.
That's really good. And I think the front part of that, maybe for those who don't understand, is just the first part of that is those two main grains of whatever you're going to make, rye or corn. You have to cook those, and the malt enters at a certain point after holds and at the right temperature, so then that activation can happen that you're talking about. And those sugars, that the liquefaction and saccharification start to happen, which is, as Alicia mentioned, rye is thick, very thick, and it likes to foam. But when you hit it with that malt, it becomes easier to work with. And then the sugar creation starts. And then you have a further hold until those active organisms you talked about earlier kick in, which is your yeast. So basically it's starch to sugar, yeast to sugar, alcohol comes out the other end, and a lot of CO2. So we always tell people, don't take a deep breath over top of an active fermenter, or you might inhale quite a bit of CO2.
Right. It's like a magic trick too. I'm sure Brian, Steve, and Alicia can all verify this. So for those of you who have never seen an active mash-in session, or you've never seen starch broken down into sugar in a fermenter, it's the neatest thing you'll ever see, because you can go from, and I feel bad for Steve because he's got 120-gallon hogsheads that he's stirring every day. That's you're more of a man than I'll ever be, Steve. Just saying.
Don't even say that's
right. You don't want to talk about it.
It's like I said at one other broadcast. I do it like the old catchers who caught baseball. They wore the gear as the tools of ignorance. I make mash through the tools of ignorance. So.
Yes. So you basically you start with a very thick porridge, right? So you're looking at something almost like grits, and you're adding a little bit of that malt early on. That helps thin that down a little bit. You're going to cook those most of those grains at 190 to 212 degrees, just like you would if you're cooking grits on your stove. Then you're going to drop a little later on and drop down to 145 degrees roughly. And when you add that malt, it's for me, it's always like magic. It's one of the coolest things you'll ever see. You'll see that porridge turn to soup. It loosens everything up because all those long chain starches have been broken down into fermentable sugars that the yeast can make use of. And suddenly stirring becomes a whole lot easier than it was for the first hour or so.
And a couple questions about this. That one that I've pondered, because science took a long time to catch up with the actual trades of distilling over the centuries. Just like farming science was not, they thought something was happening in the field. They didn't quite understand it. So often on tour, I'll say that you realize in the 18th century, they didn't know what an enzyme was.
Yeah, they had no idea. Right.
So I've often wondered, how did malting develop? I mean, where did that, in the old world, where did somebody realize this germinated and then this has that diastatic power to do this? We may never know, but it's always been a curious thing to me. And a lot of science is often, whatever field, is you're looking for A, you never find A. Along the way, you discover D, E, and F. And maybe something like that happened that someone was trying to achieve. But I think that's important because a lot of these old trades were passed down master to apprentice. And so a phrase I use on tour is, what they knew was, he knows how to make whiskey and he told me to do these things, and it comes out the back of the still properly. So you follow those procedures, and it takes much later before you've been, I've been in big distilleries. You see the labs that people have and the scientific expertise, and you understand how important that is. But in the era like Alicia's working with and I work with, and about Alan and Brian works with, there was not a lot of that scientific basis for them. They were doing a trade.
I always wonder that about yeast. So they don't know that it's a single-celled organism, but it's impossible to ferment without it. So when I'm coming into this not knowing anything and reading to try to figure out when yeast was discovered, and then I find out it's discovered way after the Overholt were very prolific distillers, and it's like my brain just breaks, and I'm like, but they needed it. Like it obviously exists, but it has a different name, and they don't know why it is, but they know that it is.
That it is, yeah. They knew how, but they didn't know why. Yeah, that's the whole thing.
Some of that answer, at least, may come through the bakers.
Yeah.
You know, we've been working with an 18th century baker, Justin Cherry. If you want to check him out on Instagram, it's Half Crown Bakehouse, and he has a bake oven that he built. And you know, he studied a lot about early baking, and he's a guy actually I'd love to have on the program at some later date. But you're right. How did they know about that? I mean, how does that come into the equation? I mean, somebody figured it out, or we wouldn't have had those early distillations working.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. Or even, you know, and it could be somewhat, you know, the very early stuff as far as working with malt could be as simple as like the honey thing, right? It could be somebody left their grain out, it got wet, it germinated, you know, they let it dry. Oh, we can still save this. It'll still be okay. They tasted it. It was sweet. Well, then maybe they went to cook their bread or their beer, either way, and there was some ungerminated grain in there, and hey, that did a whole different thing that we didn't know that it was going to do. There's some sweetness there. So as someone just said, that reverse engineering of natural processes, or even with yeast, even amongst beer brewers, it's interesting. We've just recently, Brian, myself, and Christy Atkinson, several others, have just recently been playing with some Norse stone beers and using Kveik yeast. So Kveik is just an old Norse word for yeast. They didn't know it was yeast, but they knew that they needed it. They knew that they had to have it. So
a Norse word, that takes you back quite a ways.
It does. And there's some agricultural stuff there too. And I'll throw this out as an aside, and then I definitely want to get Aidan to comment on the fruit side of things too, because I know he knows more than probably all of us on the fruit side of things. But on the North side, different traditions with different agriculture, right? So everybody thinks whiskey, if you know your whiskey history, came from Ireland, Scotland, etc. And it definitely did. Everybody thinks it's a Gaelic thing, and it probably, for the most part, was. There were a lot of trained monks that had some history behind them. They knew brandy, etc., who wrote down everything they did. But as we learn more about history, and we learn that people are imitating their neighbors, or people have traditions of their own, they're developing their own products, etc., it's become apparent to me that there may be a secondary line of whiskey progenitors from the Gauls, who were Norse in nature, right? Making stone beers or geists, using things other than hops to flavor their beer, basically imitating their more educated Gael neighbors. And that's a whole new thing, but there's some interesting history there with using, you know, heather blooms, for example, in a beer geist. And then later on, as late as 1920, there's a book written called From Berm to Bottle about Scotland, and heather blooms show up in Lagavulin in 1920 at a time when they shouldn't, and no one at Lagavulin at the time knows why they're there, just that they've always used them.
I'm going to direct the conversation just a little bit. We've got a question from the audience, and then we're actually going to be able to segue into Aidan talking about the fruit side really easily, because it's almost time for another toast. And so our question from the audience is, would a multi-grain like corn or rye require gelatinization?
Yeah, I was going to step out and grab some coffee, but that's okay. I heard the question, so that's a good one. So no, it doesn't have to, because it's already been turned into, it's already got sucrose in it. So, and if you go above 145, 148, you actually, 148 Fahrenheit, you actually destabilize those enzymes. And so whatever unconverted starch is in that grain is not going to convert. So on those malt whiskeys, you really only ever go between 145, 152, 153, roughly, if you're not using artificial enzymes. You don't need that extra heat to gelatinize it or break down the cell wall in order to allow the malt to work on it, etc. So in fact, you're doing yourself a disservice if you go past 145 to 152 or so, and you start losing efficiency at that point.
So Edith Wheeler also wants to know, was any of this written, and if so, when, or was it mainly oral tradition? I think we're talking about mainly just the same way that trades were passed down from master to apprentice and so on. Not that nobody ever wrote it down, but
I think the earliest book I've got, it's I don't know the original, but it's 1657. So at some point with the growth of the Enlightenment and the development of Western Europe, you know, you do see publications on various scientific treatises that start in the 15 and 1600s, and then develop further. And I think I mentioned before one time on the show that one of the neat things we've discovered is when we developed our program, we did not have access to those books. And then now we have a couple of them. And looking back, some of the things we do in the distillery, we find that those were proper methods written down in 1740. So,
wow, that's awesome.
You know, so it's kind of looking back, we didn't do everything right, that's for sure. But we realized, like, one of the things that when you set your mash in a pot still in that period, there's no agitator in the still. And you don't want to burn the grain onto the bottom of the still. So what we did was we had a paddle and we put it in the still while the fire was just starting. And we rode for a while till the fire got pretty good. And sometimes you'll see a wisp of vapor. And then we put the cap the still.
Nice.
And otherwise, because we learned the hard way early on in 2009, working with Dave Pickrell, as we shut down at day one and we thought, well, we'll clean in the morning. And we came back and there was about 6 inches of cornbread and rye baked into the bottom of the pot still. So, then we had one or two real skinny guys. We kidded we're going to stick them head first down the still, but a lot of scraping and spraying. So, but again, like we said earlier, you learn through trial and error. And so I think that dating it, I can't be sure the earliest book, but I would say mid 1650s that some of this stuff's probably published in various places.
Well, of course, then that's the one that was written down when you're talking about trades being practiced over all of these different people in all these different places. I always think about, I'm so glad that we have the resources that were written down, but then also what was lost, for all those people and all that experience.
And we think about, trade secrets today or corporate espionage. They didn't write everything down for a reason also.
Yeah.
There's a mill book on historic mills from 1795 written by Oliver Evans. And he was a millwright. And the English millwright I knew told me, he goes, I read that book. I know what he's talking about. Everything's not in there. He expected you as a millwright or a tradesman to probably already know certain things or figure it out. So I think a lot of that was protected, but
a lot of those old distillers manuals, like you're kind of talking about there, they're the same way. They're very vague. They're very generalized. They expect you to know a certain amount of information before you ever get a hold of them. And even before there were really distillers manuals in the United States, a lot of the early distillation was based on the women of the household, right? In particular. And so you'll go back to a lot of the old cookbooks and you'll have a section right in the very front before you ever get to anything about food, which is all about distillation or making beer or making wine, etc. But they never go into great detail. They kind of give you a base recipe because they expect that you already know those things, or they're trying to hold things back, as you just mentioned, Steve. And the first time that I really noticed that was even this past year. And, we've had a great year to be able to sit down and focus on some things we might not ordinarily get to. But researching absinthe, as Brian and I talked about earlier, you go back to those absinthe recipes and they're holding stuff back, and they're holding it back for a reason. There are things that they don't want you to know. They might put you on a basic, simple path to get something like absinthe, but they're not telling you the whole story. So,
yeah. Well, why don't we, because I need a drink. I think Aiden needs to tell us about.
And Aiden, I noticed we shop at the same place for our drinking vessels.
Yeah, they're a fine maker of stoneware. So
I'm glad to see you're both drinking light, with a vessel like that. So.
Of course. Okay, so I guess we'll take a quick break so Steve can grab a drink, and we'll have ourselves a toast first. So since we've been talking about malted grains and have had a great plethora of information, I'll offer up an Irish blessing as a toast. This is one I saw in a pub one night when I was playing music with some friends, and I've kind of held on to it ever since. So if you'll all raise your glasses. As you slide down the banister of life, may the splinters never point the wrong way. Cheers.
Cheers.
So with that.
That is so Irish.
Yeah. So with that, I guess I can speak a little bit about fruit. I definitely don't have near the amount of experience of some of the people that are here on this talk. But I've done a few things with apples and with pears, and of course, the key difference between that and grain is that once you kind of crush the fruit and then press it, the sugars are readily available in solution. You don't have to do anything else to it. You don't have to cook it. You don't have to do any temperature modification, anything. They're ready to go. And in fact, if you do nothing with that from there, they'll go by themselves. As anybody who's bought a farm fresh cider and maybe left it in their fridge for just a little bit too long will discover. So your bottle will start to kind of blow out, and it'll taste a little funky. So of course, now in terms of modern day cider, a lot of it's all very controlled because from reading and from trying ciders from around the world, it seems to me it's mostly it's a market thing. People expect to taste certain things when they drink something. However, if you go back to kind of the English-French tradition, in many cases, even still today, they're going and they're pressing their fruit. And I think there was one farm that I saw that they've been growing apples there and making cider since the 1200s in England. And what they do when they collect their juice after they finally press it and everything is they literally put it in these giant garbage totes and leave them out in the orchard. They'll leave them there for about 2 or 3 days, I think is what they said, and then they bring them in. So, there, in the case of that farm, they've been growing apples there since the 1200s. There's some level of yeast selection that's happening there. So for them, they could pretty easily probably set that out and get a nice product. Whereas, say if we did it and, in the case of some of my cider making, I set it out in my garage, God only knows what it could wild ferment. But some of those wild ferment flavors aren't necessarily a bad thing. It just, it all comes down to personal taste in a lot of fruit drinks like cider and perry. There's a taste that they call barnyard taste. And that can be very, very off-putting to a lot of people, but it can also add a lot of depth and complexity to it as well. So it really just comes down to personal taste. I personally haven't tried doing that yet, but I think if we get a good apple season this year, I'm hoping to try doing some wild ferment experiments to kind of try with that. Because so far, mostly to kind of control what I'm working with, because that juice has so many sugars readily available to ferment right away. I've tried to kind of control what is going in there. So just as a quick addition, as far as what sugars are typically available, you've got high levels of sucrose, fructose, and sorbitol. And this is one of the things that's kind of fun to play with different fruit, is that even different variants of apples and pears have higher or lower levels of sorbitol. And it's kind of a wild card because the yeast can't ferment the sorbitol. So whatever sorbitol you have going in is what you're going to have coming out. And, you may think that you fermented it fully dry, but it's still going to come out just a hair bit sweet. So I tried my first experiment with perry this fall, and it came out a little strange. I think some of that is the leftover sorbitol. It stayed a little sweeter than what I originally had intended. So yeah.
Well, that makes me think about something that I wanted to ask Alan and everyone about, is unfermentable sugars.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to get everything out of that fermenter. So because I'm not a scientist, but how do we talk about that? What happens in there that we get all we can, but there's going to be some unfermentable things that remain in that fermentation vat?
Mm-hmm. On the distillation side, you get, and I think there's one more piece of fermentation we can touch on right after this, and that'll get us really to distilling 101, which will be a little easier. But in distillation, and Aiden can again comment more on fermentation itself, but in distillation, when you have those unfermentable sugars, you get a couple of interesting things that happen. So you have to be careful, because you can actually scorch those in your still when you're actually running your still if it's not agitated, which becomes an issue. If you scorch anything, whiskey or brandy, you've ruined it. It's gone. It's done. Throw it out. You're finished. It's over with. You're never gonna rectify it. You're never gonna save it. But the other thing that you get is what's called a gustatory illusion. So you don't actually distill those sugars across. They never rise with the vapor and come across. So you're never going to taste a brandy, for example, and taste sweetness. You might think you taste sweetness, though, and that's through the aroma that you're picking up. Those sugars that are unfermented that go into the still, their aroma precursors do travel across through distillation. And so if you ever taste anything that seems sweet to you, it's because of those unfermented sugars. It's not that you're tasting it, it's that you're smelling it. It's there, it convinces your brain, it actually lights up the part of your brain that is connected to food as opposed to alcohol. Your brain starts to think that you're about to get a little bit of a treat. That's why even something, this is unfermented, but very similar concept. Not to bring absinthe back up again, but it fits. If you ever taste an absinthe without sugar in it, it may taste a little sweet to you. It's not sweet. There's no sugar there. It's just there's a perception of sugar, and your brain has picked that up, and it convinces you that there's something there that's sweet and candy-like and food-like or baked-like a pastry sort of thing, which is really interesting to me.
I think that's one of the things that if you're just trying to get up to speed as quickly as possible, that's not written down. Maybe it's somewhere, but it's probably not in any of the texts or any of the searches that you're doing to try to get up to speed really fast. So this past September, when I was really trying to figure everything out, I think I had posted like, man, I only was able to convert 80%. And then Alan, you came in and you were like, that's great. It's great that you had that 20% that you can't convert, because it's going to give you so much more in your final product. Because none of us are trying to make vodka or something that's so pure or so perfect. Like, we want it to have its soul. And I think that what I initially thought would be a failure, because I wasn't perfect, I wasn't 100%, is not a failure, because it's this balance. The whole system is this balance. And I think everything that I learn reinforces that a little bit more.
Yeah, and I'll even say this as a real quick aside to anybody who is a bourbon connoisseur or a rye connoisseur or a pre-prohibition, anybody who's ever tasted a pre-prohibition whiskey. And Steve, you see this all the time. Brian, you see it all the time. Alicia, reviewers talk about, why was whiskey before prohibition different than whiskey after prohibition? And it has everything to do with what you just said, Steve, and what Alicia just said, as well as those enzymes and the malt. That malt wasn't 100% efficient. It was never 100% efficient. There was always a little starch left behind. There was always a little unfermentable sugar left behind. And that's one of those big differences between modern whiskeys and whiskey from before prohibition, is they were never 100% efficient. There was always a little bit of inefficiency, whether it be starch compounds coming across as aromatics during distillation or sugar compounds coming across as aromatics during distillation. That changes the experience that people have from a whiskey. There's a number of other things, obviously, that affect that too, but I think that's one of the big ones that some of the non-distillers don't pick up on necessarily. You know, they write about why it was different back then, but they may not know really why it was different. And I'm not claiming that I know, but I think that that's one of the big reasons that I've picked up on over the years. And I don't know what your thoughts are there.
Barrel entry proof probably too.
Yes, that's a huge part of it. Go ahead, Steve.
But I'm just, I think a lot of this, like, to steal a phrase from Lisa Wicker, is if you ask 18 distillers, you get 22 answers. So, that's another thing that we have to remember, is that there's a lot of ways to do this, and different regional. We went from macro of countries, cultures, regional, available fermented material. I've had many people work with us at Mount Vernon, and one guy will say, never do this. Next year, the guy goes, you guys got to do this. And so part of my job over the years has been, and I realized it early on, Dave Pickrell's saying this, and Thomas McKenzie's saying this, and none of it jives. And so what I had to figure out with their help, and sometimes without telling them, what's going to work for Mount Vernon's distillery.
Yes.
And that's, because I'm not an expert like they are. But I learned that I could just tell instinctively, that's not going to work for us right here at this time. Mm-hmm. But that probably happened over and over again in these small distilling operations or on the farm. or in a company like Overholt that developed when it did, they figured out their way. And because humans are very individualistic creatures, you know, that's the way to do it. And I don't know if any of it's wrong. You know, it's just that people do things different ways.
Well, I think it's even still true now. And you know, I think if for example, Steve, you, me, Brian, and also Alicia were in the same room, and we had somebody give us a project, right? Make us this whiskey. I think that all of us sitting at the table would go, here's how you do it, you know, and then we'd have to suss out, well, okay, which one of us doesn't know what we're doing, or which piece of each person's thing is correct, or how can we make this a thing, you know, with different dueling personalities, different approaches to what we're doing. And humans are still the same now as they were 200 years ago. Basically, we're complicated, sure, and we're headstrong, and we make mistakes. But, you know, as a real quick aside, because we're almost an hour in now, I want to throw this out there real quick. So obviously we're touching on Distilling 101, and I think we all thought this would be way easier than it is, but now we've touched on a lot of the history. And so you realize how important fermentation is to distillation. There's, I think, one more subject we can touch on there before we actually move through some of the actual process of distilling. And again, this should, for anybody that's watching, this should kind of just, you know, let you see how important the fermentation side of things is. So one of the very first things in distilling is the yeast. And that's something that Alicia just touched on a while ago, who came up with that, etc. By the time you get into real distilling in the Western Hemisphere, you're looking at distillers who are at the very least trying to replicate the same yeast strain, even if they don't know exactly what it is, over and over again. And so one of the most important things for early distillers, I think, in the United States in particular, is finding a good yeast strain, because yeast was not something that you could just go down to the corner store and buy. Even until the 1860s, 1870s, it was not overly common, maybe somewhat more on the East Coast than it would be in the Midwest. But it was a distiller's first job to maintain their yeast, because that yeast was super important to the character of the whiskey. And so they would basically manage that by continuously feeding the same yeast strain over and over again, just like a sourdough starter, correct? And they would usually have these objects that they used called Donna jugs, which were typically copper jugs of 1 to 3 gallons that they could feed that yeast in every day. And they'd usually have 2 of them, one that the distiller took home with him every day, kind of took care of it as his baby, etc. The other one oftentimes was tied off to a chain and dropped in a well or a lake or a pond somewhere, cut off from oxygen and put into cold storage, essentially, so that if anything ever disastrous happened with the yeast, they would always have a backup sample of yeast. Now, there were certainly a lot of people using wild yeast, as Aidan mentioned, but even, you know, dogs at one point in time were wolves. It's just a matter of pointing them in the right direction, you know, making them bark at the right things. So I think that is the last major important piece, probably, of the fermentation side of things, before we can move into more process-oriented things, perhaps.
And Hannah had an image of a donut jug that we had pulled out earlier. Maybe she can flash that up there on her screen.
All right, so I'm actually going to drop it in the chat for everyone to get that. So hold on just a second while we make this work for us. Technology. Here we go.
And so, again, just to wrap that part up, the complexity of it, development over time, but also if you don't have a good fermentation, you're not going to make it up in the still. And so that's where we're headed now, to distillation, because it's just like the barrel's not going to fix everything.
Yes.
So just to catch everybody up, just to ground us all where we are, since this is Distilling 101, what has happened over this past hour is the yeast has eaten sugar in both fruit and grain, and it has excreted alcohol. Go.
Why did you not do that in the first 5 minutes, Brian?
I would have shaved 45 minutes off this talk.
Right. That's perfect, man. Jeez.
The Donna jug is in the chat for anyone who wants to see it. And y'all just let me know when you want to see the next couple images that we have on tap here.
Awesome. Thank you.
So from that fermented juice or mash, you've now got to extract that alcohol, and that's what the distillation will do, separating things out by boiling temperature on its most basic level. So, and the early ways to do that were a simple pot. And so that's what I'm most familiar with, but there's other ways. But, you know, you basically get that mash into the pot, heat that copper pot. The alcohol will turn to vapor first, separating from your water and grains, and come down the line arm into this famous coil or condenser as a gas. And then you run that cool water around that coil to condense that gas back to liquid, which is your distillate. So, you know, that's the nickel tour at Mount Vernon. But within that, there's a lot of complexity about what comes off the still when, and of course the things you have to do, particularly at the front of the run, because I think we get those questions a lot, you know, because people do know that there's things in certain alcohol you don't want to. There you go. He's got it right there.
Oh, very nice.
That's his daughter's Christmas present, I think.
Start them early.
Yeah, start them early. Yeah,
Yeah.
start them early.
So, but Alicia, anybody can add whatever you want about process of a still running, but I think we need to talk about in a minute what comes off there that you need to be mindful of, particularly at the beginning of your run.
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead, Alicia. You go.
Odd, but oftentimes I think of the Rifleman's Creed. You know, there are many like it, but this one is mine. All of the stills are different, and no matter how many people I shadow or say, I'll say to Sam Komlenik, who's on our board and a great resource to me, I want to go to this still, and I want to follow this guy around, and he'll go and see him ferment, because, or mash in, or don't bother with that still because he has a column or she has a hybrid, or this doesn't pertain to you. But like, I want to know them all, but I want to know mine. Like, I want to put mine through different tasks. I want to run it in the winter, in the spring, and in the summer, and I want to run different things through it and see what she does. And I think that that's kind of like we're into the romance of it now. Like, this is the fun part. Everything else up to this part is necessary mess in my mind. But now, like, this is the magic. Like, the still is the magic to me.
And what you said is so true, because every still has its own idiosyncrasies and weather affects it. And, you know, we've got 5 at Mount Vernon, and every one has its own personality. And then you add different weather, and it's going to run different than it did the day before. And so you know, you just have to learn your, you know, like a weather person watching the weather, and then know that still's proclivities.
Yeah,
and that just comes through practice. You know?
It's so frustrating to try to, like, when you don't know this and you're just kind of like plunked, and it's like, oh great, here's all this stuff, and you're like, this is going to be fun. It is not. It's
well,
it did this yesterday and I can't replicate it, and I don't know why. And the end reason is because it's raining. Like,
barometric pressure. Yeah.
Well, that's what things.
For the benefit of the audience that may not have heard yet, the other ones we've been here, you did get just thrown into this in a unique way. So maybe you should just take a couple minutes, and I think it's a great story, because it's like, okay, Alicia, here you go.
So West Overton is a small historic museum with a titan of a past and an ambition of unlimited proportions. So in 2015, our founder of this project, I guess, our CEO, sent a very simple email that said, let's build a little still setup outside that we can do demos on during fun events. And somehow that turned into opening a commercial distillery. I came along in 2017, and I am a very detail-oriented, project manager-minded person. And I said, oh, I can help us get a boiler installed. I can help get contractors in. My dad's a contractor. I speak that language. I'll be great at this. So navigate through bids and estimates and installs, get the still where it goes, get the boiler in the boiler room, get the piping on the walls. And I'm like, all right, who's the distiller? And they're like, well, we don't know yet. We
Tag, you're it.
We have some ideas. a consultant's gonna come and, you know, you should come because you ask a lot of good questions and we'll all take notes and this will be great. I do ask a lot of questions. So I'm taking notes and they're saying things and I'm like, what temperature again? Like, why does that work that way? How does this break down? And at some point during this, I guess whoever asks the most questions gets to be the distiller. Which is great. I mean, I like to say being a distiller is somewhere between being a rock star and a spy. There's just an intangible element to it where like you get to like you feel like you're 12 feet tall. Like people beg to be a distiller. Like, oh, if I could just open a distillery. And it fell on my lap and I was completely unprepared in any way for it. But like, how do you give that back? You don't. Like, if somebody allows you to be a distiller, you take it. Like, so that started a year-long process of cooking grain and figuring out the still and worrying about poisoning people and all of the nuance that comes to it, and making like the best acquaintances that you ever could, because I expected it to be an industry full of trade secrets and cloak and dagger, like you can't look while I put this in the pot kind of things. It's not that way at all. And I think it comes back to the intricacies of the stills. It doesn't matter if someone tells me how to make their bourbon because I can't replicate it. There's no possible way for me to make Steve's brandy or Alan's absinthe. I can't, even if I wanted to try. So that's how I ended up a distiller. And if they want to take it from me now, they'll have to fight me for it because
I think
it's amazing.
It's part of your heart. It's part of your heart now. And
it is.
You left out one of the glories of distilling, besides the rockstar thing, is the floor drains.
Oh.
And all the glory that, you know, people, you know, forget about the mess of it.
Yeah. And just to jump back to agriculture and preservation real quick. I knew from our tour that the reason why the Overholts distilled was to preserve and prolong the shelf life of their crops. But you don't really think about what that means, and what it means is keep the bugs out of it. So we were in it, and I got 1,000 pounds of grain and I piled it up on a pallet and I covered it in a tarp, and I'm like, I'll get to that when I get to it. And then I take off the tarp and it's bugs. It's just awful. And it's like
out of the boll weevil.
This is like that. This is what we're preserving it from. I don't know what I thought was happening to that grain, but I didn't think it was bugs. And I luckily it was already, you know, important to me that, you know, I incorporated distiller as part of who I am now, because I think if that had been day one, I don't think I would have went back. Like it was just so heartbreaking. Like, oh my God, that's all ruined now.
Well, in the early period, they called for the millers when that happened. That was just high protein flour.
That's all the rage now. I mean, it would be keto, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's what you ship downstream.
But you mentioned not poisoning people, which leads us to
yes.
Let's talk about
reviews. Everybody who's out there, we've had the alcohol has now risen. It's running down the arm and it's condensing. Do we want to drink all that?
No, for sure. So, so you guys have got the basic process that Steve has given you. So the most of early America, not all of early America, was doing double pot still distillation. So you're running that distillation 2 times. You're running it one time to capture all the alcohol, and the second time that you run that still, you're taking all the alcohol that you captured the first time, putting it back in the still, and that's when you're going to start doing this thing called making cuts. And those cuts are different fractions of alcohol. Different alcohols boil at different points. There are different alcohols that are actually palatable. There are certain alcohols that are actually poisonous in the right quantities to a certain extent. There's definitely things that you don't want to drink if for no other reason than you don't want a terrible hangover. So although there are worse consequences if you were to drink the right fractions worth of alcohol. So typically most distillers back in the day were cutting the alcohol into maybe 3 to 4 different fractions. We'll stick with the basic 3 here because it's pretty easy to understand. If you're talking about a pot still, on that second distillation run, you have what's called your heads. Then the second fraction is called your hearts. The third fraction is called your tails. And each one of those has its own interesting connotations, starting with the heads. Steve, would you like to talk a little bit on that part too?
Well, there's just certain compounds that come over with the heads initially off the still. The probably most volatile, dangerous one is methanol. Mm-hmm. And so in our situation with the rye whiskey, we do it by smelling and a little bit of taste, just to dip on your tongue, and it'll be a little green apple-y with rye whiskey, at least in our setting. And so once you check that period of time, you'll start to taste that rye flavor come through. And then you're easing into the hearts. Now, if it's your first pass, we do a small heads cut the first time off the still. The real critical one is the second time through when you're finishing it, because you want to air deeper into the hearts to make sure you don't get any of those compounds that are going to hurt people or be bad flavors. But I know more of the technical layers of it as far as heads go, Alan and Alicia, because I'm still a historian, not as much on the science end, but maybe you could add a little bit more to that.
Yeah, you got the right idea there for sure. And the idea is that your methanol boils before most of your ethanol does, although that's not entirely true. You do get a little methanol throughout the entirety of the run. There's no way to remove it completely. But you don't want to ingest methanol, especially not pure methanol. It does cause optic nerve damage. So it's what you hear about moonshiners drinking and going blind. The other thing it does is that once it hits your system, it turns into formic acid and then eventually formaldehyde, and it causes long-term liver damage, which is incredibly scary stuff. Interestingly enough, the cure for methanol poisoning, if you catch it early on, is actually ethanol. You have to still have the methanol in your system. You basically dilute it out with high-proof ethanol. So you dilute it out of your blood. But once it's there, once you've actually ingested it and broken it down, you can't get rid of it. So you catch most of it in your heads. And as Steve mentioned with rye whiskey, for example, it has a little apple note to it. With brandy, a lot of times it comes off as raspberry. And it's super intriguing in brandy because you might smell it. You might even taste a little bit of it and go, there's something really good there. But it's not good for you. It's not something you want in there. And you have to be even more careful yet with brandies because pectin in particular converts directly into methanol. So for example, with an apple brandy, you're always going to have a fours cut or a heads cut that's going to be substantially larger than it would be with a whiskey.
Yeah, very true. We did apple in November and that was the case. We took really, really wide cuts.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky. And
when I first started, I was shocked that there wasn't some sort of litmus paper that I could put in the stream that I'm like, oh, well, this is still pink, so it's not good yet. Like, there's no cheat. Like, you have to know it. Like, you have to know the smell. Like, you have to know what it feels like. And that was really shocking to me.
Mm-hmm. Hey, I got a quick question for Alan. Just back up for just a second there. You're talking about pectins. Can you use pectinase in your must basically before you ferment into brandy, or are there ill effects of the pectinase in the still?
So that's an interesting question that I think a lot of distillers get confused. I'll hear a lot of apple brandy distillers say that they use pectinase. You shouldn't. And the reason that you shouldn't is because that precursor that you break it down into is going to convert directly to methanol once it's underneath heat. So all you're doing is you're freeing up that much more methanol to come across in that distillation. Now, if you know what you're doing, then you know that methanol has no discernible smell or taste itself most of the time. Maybe a slight raspberry, maybe a slight apple, as Steve just said, but overall a little lighter than what you get from, say, acetaldehyde, ethyl acetate, the things that are true heads in a whiskey. Then you can get away with it. But it's not something that I would highly recommend to most distillers. I think most distillers are going to miss it the first 100 times that they do it, in all honesty, or they're going to be deceived by it because it's definitely a little deceiving in nature. And that's really the trick for those who are listening, who are interested in those cuts that are being made. So most of the time, methanol, again, as I said, has no discernible taste or flavor. If it does, it's a lighter flavor. And Steve, you can probably verify this too, Alicia, and you as well. But there's really kind of an extra cut in there. You get rid of those fours. The 4 shots are really your methanol. Then your heads are kind of something different. But
yeah,
once you start to smell fingernail polish remover, once you start to get a fingernail polish remover sort of aroma, and then move from that fingernail polish remover aroma to almost an earthy sort of aroma, you've moved from your methanol into acetaldehyde and ethyl acetate. Now, you don't want acetaldehyde in your alcohol. Depending on if you're going to age it or not, you may or may not want a little ethyl acetate, but you've then removed most of that methanol, most of that compound that you don't want in most spirits. Although I will tell you as well, there are some spirits, particularly with New World crops, who do not release their methanol because of different azerotypes with water and alcohol until the tails fraction. And that's a whole new world of stuff that distillers are finding now.
Wow,
so
that's interesting. So let's talk about tails. So we get into hearts, which is the good flavors, good body of proof. And at some point with our rye, you know, you start to get, like the term, the dishwater taste. It starts to lose that punch, and you know you're heading into tails. You want a little bit of tails, but if you gather too much of that, like into the barrel, it's, you know, garbage in, garbage out. You're adding back or cutting back stuff. If you're trying to make proof, you're actually hurting your end product.
Yes.
And,
yeah.
I mean, you know, we learned that over the long haul. But one other thing I wanted to add before we maybe talk about tails is that I don't think we need to mention why copper. You know, because I know after World War II, a lot of distilleries went to stainless steel and realized that's not going to work, because copper has certain abilities. It's not just a conductor of heat. That's what you initially think. It's a good conductor of heat, but it actually works to remove sulfurous compounds and other compounds during distillation from your product. And I think that's worth maybe touching on a little bit.
I agree, and that's one of the things. So people always have that idea of copper in stills, and copper is the best material, in my opinion, to make a still out of. Although there have been other materials. Wood early on was used in still. You'll find some wooden stills in the Caribbean to this day, which is pretty interesting. But you'll always see copper in the vapor path for the reason that Steve's talking about. So copper is a catalyst. It's positively ionically charged. If you remember back to your high school chemistry class, those sulfates that you want to remove are negatively ionically charged. So that copper actually has the ability to grab those things that you don't want from fermentation, those kind of boiled egg, kind of meaty smells and tastes and flavors. It actually grabs them and pulls them out of the vapor and drops them back out of solution back into the pot. This is kind of interesting for those who are interested in antique distilling equipment too, because the still, every time you run it, it's sacrificing a little bit of itself. It's giving a little bit of its essence up. It's giving a little bit of copper up every time that it runs. If you go into a distillery and you look at a still, you see a smooth, shiny piece of copper. But if you were to look at it under a microscope, you'd see all these little hills and valleys. And those little hills and valleys are where all of those different things that you don't want from your fermentation end up at. And they're not able to distill across because now they are bonded to, and this sounds incredibly odd saying it, I think the first time I ever said this in front of anyone, they're now bonded to a heavy metal, which is not going to distill across. So it's going to fall out of solution and be gone and not be a danger to anyone.
Yeah, and I think that's just interesting when I learned that, because coming at it from a different way, you just think, okay, copper heats well. It's all about conducting heat. There, I didn't really realize the property that was critical to the copper, and so that really polishes that whiskey. Particularly that second pass. It's bringing the proof up, but it's also refining it in another way.
One of the traditions that I love about distilling, Stephen, I think you have the same experience, is talking to anyone from Ireland or Scotland and talking about how copper interacts with what you're distilling. And they don't talk about it in the scientific, way we just did. It's the conversation of the spirit and the copper.
That's what I think I told you that story about Andy Cant, who worked with us and made single malt. Andy ran a Carduce distillery for 35 years. And I got to visit him before he retired. And he was explaining how the line arms of their still are angled slightly up rather than downwards. And his phrase was, with that lovely accent, we want the spirit to have a lot of conversation with the copper.
Mm-hmm.
So that reflux back into the still. So that's, I love that sort of that poetry of a trade or an art, you know, because there is, like Alicia referred to, it's the art and the magic of it in the pot. That's with him speaking to 35 years of experience making Johnny Walker and all the other Cardhu whiskeys. And just to flash back with that story with him, he talked about fermentation, because he said to me, in Scotland, we have water, malt, and yeast. And why do all these whiskeys taste so very different?
Mm-hmm.
And on the front end, it's length of fermentation. And so all the Cardhu whiskeys are very grassy. And he explained to me that, and some of the local distilleries nearby, because they're known for their nuttier flavors.
Mm-hmm.
And he explained how they ferment. So it's just interesting that different distilleries, different ways, but in Scotland, it's very different because they have those 3 ingredients.
Well, and, Alicia kind of touched on this earlier too, and I think we've touched this on this in the show in the past before we get to Tales here. You know, you can't replicate someone else's whiskey. You can attempt to, but you're never going to get it exactly right because of the distiller, because of conditions, etc. But even if, for example, and Steve, you see it every day, right? You don't have any 2 stills that are the same size, but let's say that all 5 of your stills were the same size. All 5 of them, even if it was you running all 5 of them, firing all 5 of them, making the cuts off of all 5 of them, and all 5 of them were running the same exact product, they're all going to taste slightly different because each of those stills, each fermentation, every variable you can imagine is going to affect what that finished whiskey tastes like and what its character is. And even on maybe a deeper, somewhat spiritual level, maybe how it makes you feel as an end user, right? It's all another key to something, you know, far beyond the ordinary, far beyond the pale, etc. And that's what makes it so much fun. I think that's why even Alicia right now, as a new distiller, she's falling in love with it. She's in love with it because she's seeing those things and those effects and how they play not only into her daily perception, but other people's daily perception of what's happening.
Very true. Very true.
I think that lay people that know a lot about drinking whiskey, and they probably know way more than me about drinking bourbon or rye or selecting different bottles. You know, I find that when I'm giving a tour, I'm lost for words when somebody who's very educated in drinking whiskey asks me why I don't do something a certain way. I had a gentleman, you know, challenge me on a temperature. I said, I'm sorry, my way. Like and if you've never operated the equipment, or maybe you've just done like a stovetop model, like, not to poo-poo that experience, but like if that worked, I would do it that way. And I can't tell you why it doesn't. I can just tell you it's not going to work here. So I struggle with that a little bit because I never want to make anyone feel dumb or like their lived experience is somehow less than or not applicable, but I can't tell you why I can't do it that way. I just can't.
Alicia, you give it 5 more years and you'll understand completely why you feel that way now and why you won't feel that way in 5 years. You'll be like, maybe in Magic Land in your kitchen it works that way, but not so much. But
well, when you're in that historical setting giving tours too, your job is to be as kind as you can to your visitors. So
right.
One of those things.
I sometimes forget my levity in the alcohol industry as a craft distiller, so I apologize. Yes, you're correct. Absolutely.
Well, as I said earlier in the pre-show, we would just go back to the office and say, well, what was the craziest thing that was said to you today? And you vent there and then you move on. But, you know, part of it is people are so interested in alcohol. That's why we all love it and we're all here. So it's understandable that people throw questions at us. And you know, I think you just field them the best you can.
Yeah, I agree.
Guys, we're getting close to the end, so let's wrap it up. I think we got another toast coming up. If Hannah has any questions, she's going to shoot them to me. And I think that we all agreed that I would stay as a host, and if anybody wanted to stick around and ask more questions, we would do that.
Yeah. And let's maybe just 2 minutes from Alan on Tales, and then do a toast. That'll kind of close out the process.
And he disappeared.
Perfect.
Oh, there.
Yeah. I had to switch something up. It was getting on my nerves looking at the same thing over and over again. So
that was your granddad, I know.
Right. You made me lose track of what I was doing, Steve. Thank you, sir. So the tails, as you were mentioning, you know, that's where you start to get into where you have more water than you do ethanol, and you start to find these odd flavors. You start to find these, for me, boiled cauliflower, boiled squash, not overly attractive in their nature as they are. Although they are important to double pot still distillation, and bear in mind that when we're talking about early American distillation, early distillation in general, there's no such thing as bad alcohol. At some point, most of it's going to be recycled to some extent in order to make product or to stretch product. Whether that seems like a good idea in modern terms or not, that's the way that it was back then. So that low proof stuff where that water starts coming across. One thing that I never hear on distilling tours is any romanticism about the tails, because it's easy to look at them as waste alcohol or bad alcohol. But the truth of the matter is, those tails, even though they're not going to be what you're going to consider potable spirit, what you're going to drink, barrel age, etc., ship downstream later on, wherever it's going to end up at end user, they are very important to the consistency of pot still distillation. As we've just talked about, there's no real consistency in pot still distillation. Batch to batch, it varies. Day to day, it varies. Still to still, it varies, etc. But where you do get some amount of flavor from is those tails. And so often, even in the old distilling manuals, you will see most distillers add those tails, whether it's brandy or whiskey, back into the next doubling run of that same product. And the reason for that is those tails, and where you have that much more water, you have basically distilled the essential oil of the raw product that you fermented. And that essential oil is going to become flavor for further batches. It's also going to give you a few more proof gallons, because again, you're not about waste during these agricultural times, these times of survival. So often, you know, if someone is going to make 70 batches of one particular whiskey in a year, they're going to use those tails 70 times, one right after the other, in order to bring that much more of the flavor to the forefront. As a quick aside, you know, those different cultural things we talked about earlier, and different romanticism involved in language, and sort of another throwback to absinthe, because it's starting to kind of seem like my life revolves around absinthe. The French have a word for it. They call it a blanquette, just like you would call a blanket, right? So the idea behind that is that those oils are there as a recovery mechanism, as a comfort mechanism, to make sure that you have enough of the essential components of the raw materials that went into the product in order to make the next generation even better than the last generation. Do I win Jeopardy?
Yeah. That was awesome. So I'll go ahead. We've got a really good question. I think this is for Alicia specifically. Would malted rye help reduce your reliance on manufactured enzymes?
We've thought about that. So I think the first step is to try our mash bill the way that it is now that we've kind of refined our temperatures, and see if we need to change anything. And then if that ferment is not exactly what we want, we've thought about taking that 80% non-malted rye and maybe adding another 10% of malt, but making it malted rye. So we still have the same amount of rye, just increasing our malt a little bit, and then going from there. So it's something we're open to, and I should have time this year to experiment with it.
As a little deeper dive on that too, Alicia, so interestingly enough, and you've probably already discovered this by now, malted rye, so there are different systems for figuring out how much diastatic power or how much ability you have to convert grain into sugar from enzymes based on malt. Malted rye is almost as high in diastatic power as malted barley is. It's actually higher than 2-row malted barley, which is around 150 or so, what they call DP. Distiller's malt 6-row malt is about 250 DP. Malted rye is about 190 DP. And then rye itself, even unmalted, actually has, believe it or not, a slight amount of diastatic power, at least enough to convert itself from starch into sugar, which I think very few distillers know or understand, which is very interesting, especially for some of those interesting old rye-based mash bills. It explains why some of those mash bills worked when in theory they shouldn't.
I had read that, And I was so excited about it. And I repeated that fact to someone else, and they said, rye doesn't convert on its own. And I said, no, I read it. It has diastatic power. And they're like, I think you must have read that wrong, which I get, you know, sometimes I'm really new at this. So, you know, maybe I read it wrong, but I'm glad to hear it again.
No, that was the 5 distillers, 8 answers.
Yeah, right.
Yes. Steve and I actually had the same conversation about the George Washington mash bill at one point in time, trying to figure out how that was actually mashed in. And I thought that for sure the proportions had to be wrong, and that's humility of distilling. I was wrong. The proportions of George Washington were right. If you go back to the old distilling manuals, they'll tell you in the summertime, the rye distillers did not usually use malt because malt has some diastatic power of its own accord. Or the rye itself has diastatic power.
I think if I recall correctly, some of the challenges of that conversation were that I was talking to a malt house who obviously wants to sell more malts. And they, you know, we also had a conversation about distiller's malt versus the Pilsner malt. And I said, well, I am a distiller, so I want distiller malt. And they said, well, I don't have that, but I have Pilsner malt. You should just buy the Pilsner malt. And that's all I needed to hear from that vendor to know that I don't need to buy anything from them.
That's right. The right tools for the right job. That's correct. Yes. And
could you have us raise our glass one more time?
Yes, sir. I think so.
Okay, so for our last toast, I'd just like to kind of make a toast to the agriculture, because, you know, without the agricultural products, we'd be nowhere. So we wouldn't be making any of this fun stuff. So we'll raise our glass and we'll say, to warm sun and singing rain, corn, hop, barley, and grain, to good harvest and another one, apple, grape, pear, and plum, to our farmers short and tall, and to good spirits for us all. Cheers.
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 Well, everybody, I don't think you have to leave us if you don't want to. If you're tired of us, feel free to. But I just want to thank everybody for being here with us tonight. Finally reviving the Punch Bowl. It had been a few months. It's great to be back with everybody. I just want to say, especially too, I'm not working full time at Locust Grove anymore, and so seeing Hannah and seeing Caitlin was just very refreshing, and just being back with the whole crew here at the Punch Bowl. So thanks for coming out to see us. Please support all these organizations. You know, we're all making it, but COVID has given everybody some hard times, and we'll be talking about our distilling season at Locust Grove. I mean, I didn't have as much to say tonight because I'm the one in this group who doesn't actually get to run his still. We mash and then we send it off to Kentucky Artisan Distillery, but we'll be coming out with a new schedule soon for Locust Grove, and you can come down and see us actually mashing in the right way. If you're out to Mount Vernon, though, you know, by all means, they get to see the whole process through. And of course, at West Overton, really neat place. Really exciting to see all that coming together. And Spirits of French Lick, Alan is, you know, he incorporates his passion into history and everything he does. So thank you so much. I see Hannah's back.
I'm back with a few administrative announcements. First of all, thank you so much to all of you for joining us this evening. Should be checking your email over the next week for a list of resources from your distillery experts. A quick reminder to your distillery experts to send me any last minute additions to the list of resources. And then that email will also include a link to this program so you can review it or catch up if you logged in a little bit after we got started. Or I'm sad to say the pre-show conversation will be cut out of that. If you would like the director's distiller's cut, I guess the distiller's cut, let me know. I'll make one with the conversation about Rodney Dangerfield and best historical dramas as well. Yes. But we stay tuned for new dates from the Punch Bowl, and you can also in that email that I will send out will be links to each of the organization's websites so that you can sign up to receive information from them. Remember to follow all of these great organizations and businesses on social media, and you can also donate if you so choose. But thank you so much for being with us this evening. Brian, any final words? I'm going to make you the host.
Can I interrupt real quick as a real quick aside for anyone who has watched? Yeah, anyone who has watched this who wants to go deeper in that resource section, there are 4 books in particular that you should look into for sure. And one of them is now out of print, but you can find it on Google Books very easily. And it changes the entire history of distillation in Kentucky, written by a Mr. Bouguereau, who is French, originally published in Pennsylvania and then later published in Kentucky, I believe in 1818. But it is eye-opening if you really want to understand the history of distillation in the United States, and it's one that I highly recommend. Also, as another real quick aside, Brian himself has an interesting show coming up that I think would interest a lot of people here. The Victorian Barkeeper. So, Barroom, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, it's called the Victorian Barroom. It's going to be a YouTube show, seasons of like 10 episodes apiece. And yeah, we're not going to take any particular chronological order, but we're just going to explore the evolution of drinking through the Victorian period. So raw footage is in the can and editing to come. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you.
And information on Brian's budding YouTube channel will also be included in the resource list that will hit your emails sometime within the next week. So we're pleased to have all of that. Any final words before we just wrap up our formal evening and throw it away for conversation?
Well, the last toast to farmers was apropos because Robert McDonald's on the show tonight, and he grows a lot of incredible grain for distillers. And I just wanted to, I saw him in the fall, I think, at a mill in Pennsylvania, but I just wanted to acknowledge Bob's work there.
Great farmer, offering some great stuff.
Bob
for
grows
sure.
all of our rye. I couldn't hope for a better partner in agriculture.
Yes. As a farmer, it's exciting to see people like him in the industry and doing what they're doing and providing those resources to farm distillers who otherwise would not have them and have access to them.
Exactly.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Well, thanks so much for being with us all.
A lot of fun to reconvene with everybody. I enjoyed it very much.
Stay tuned for more from the Punch Bowl. And Brian, the chair is yours.